Is this some special place? This is the Inn of the Kneeling Man, m'lady. It stands upon the very spot where the last king in the north knelt before Aegon the Conqueror to offer his submission. That's him on the sign, I suppose. Torrhen had brought his power south after the fall of the two kings on the Field of Fire, but when he saw Aegon's dragons and the size of his host, he chose the path of wisdom and bent his frozen knees. Brienne Tarth, Cleos Frey, and Jaime Lannister. A Storm of Swords, Chapter 11. Jaime 2. After defeating the ancient kings of House Gardner and Lannister at the Field of Fire, and raising House Tyrell as Lords of Highgarden and Lords Paramount of the Reach, the Westerlands and most of the Reach were under the control of Aegon the Conqueror and House Targaryen. Aegon's intent at this time was to continue his march south and enforce the submission of Oldtown, the Arbor, and then his biggest test in Dorne. But while still at Highgarden, word of a new challenge came to his ears, which diverted his attention. House Hightower and Oldtown could wait, as King Torrhen Stark, king in the north, after many weeks of preparation and gathering of his men, had crossed the neck and entered the Riverlands, leading an army of savage Northmen, 30,000 strong. Aegon started northward at once atop his dragon, Balerion, flying ahead of the army, sending word to his queens Visenya and Rhaenys as well to follow after him. He rallied his ever-growing army of men who had bent the knee at his landing after the burning of Harrenhal, the last storm, and the Field of Fire. It seemed even without dragons, the Targaryens would be more than a match for the Northmen. One thing for sure at this stage, if battle was fought, then regardless of dragons or numbers of men, it was all but certain to be just as bloody, if not more so, than those that had defined the conquest thus far. Even after crossing the neck, the march for the Northmen to meet their foes was still going to be long, despite them marching at their fullest speed, and they did indeed march with haste, hardly stopping to rest and camp each night. King Torrhen, if he could, would have liked to have marched without stopping for long rests to catch the Targaryen host off guard, but he was also well aware the pace of their movements would inevitably tire and drain the energy of his men, which could in itself be a deciding factor when battle was joined. When Torrhen Stark eventually reached the banks of the Trident, the size of Aegon's army was significantly bigger than he had been informed when he left Winterfell. He found a host, again half the size of his own, around 60,000 men strong, many of them fresh, at the very least well rested, likely having been camped for a long while. Riverlords, Westermen, Stormlanders, men of the Reach, they all had come. But it was not the size of the army on the other side of the river that gave King Torrhen pause. Above their camps, Balerion, Meraxes and Vhagar, the fire and sheer power behind Aegon and his conquest, prowled the skies in ever-widening circles. It does seem that King Torrhen was at least somewhat more informed than his peers when it came to the power of a dragon, let alone 3. Torrhen had sent scouts ahead of his main force. These men had seen the smouldering ruins of Harrenhal, where slow red fire still burnt below the rubble, many weeks after the fact. He'd also heard how a single dragon turned the tide during the last storm that saw the downfall of the Storm Kings, but more importantly, he had been given several different accounts of the events at the Field of Fire, how Aegon, despite being hugely outnumbered, burned the army of House Gardner and Lannister to cinders, with thousands dying in the process. King Torrhen Stark was not like the other kings of Westeros, and rather than ignore what he saw in front of him, he very well knew the fate of not just himself, but his 30,000 Northmen who had followed him would be bloody should he try and force a crossing of the river. Some of his lord's bannermen, however, still urged him to press the attack all the same, insisting that northern valour would carry the day. While the northern courage was admirable, it was not enough to sway King Torrhen. Others urged him instead to fall back to Moat Cailin and make their stand there on northern soil, with Moat Cailin pushing back invaders into the north for thousands of years. But Dragonfire would burn it all the same. Then, the king's bastard brother, a man by the name of Brandon Snow, offered another solution. Some say bold and brave, others foolish and a folly. He put himself forward to cross the Trident alone under the cover of darkness that very night to slay the dragons while they slept, a plan that was almost certain to fail. King Torrhen Stark, however, in the end did send Brandon Snow across the Trident, but not in the manner Brandon would have hoped for. He crossed the river with 3 maesters by his side, not to kill dragons or assassinate a king, but to treat and try and find a way forward that was palatable for both sides. It was not going to be an easy task when it was very clear that Aegon wanted Torrhen's kingdom. All through the night, messages went back and forth between the camps. The exact contents of these letters is something that has been lost to history and will forever remain between Aegon and Torrhen. But what we can say for sure is the next morning, King Torrhen Stark found himself across the Trident with a small retinue. There upon the south bank, he knelt, laid his ancient crown of Kings of Winter at Aegon's feet, and swore to be his man. He rose as Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, king no more. From that day to this, Torrhen Stark is remembered as the king who knelt. But no Northman left his burned bones beside the Trident, and the swords Aegon collected from Lord Stark and his vassals were not twisted or bent or melted as part of his Iron Throne. As we know, thanks to House of the Dragon, the idea of Aegon's prophecy has become an important part of the discussion around Aegon's conquest, with the idea that Torrhen Stark, being the king in the north, and a Stark, would be the most likely king of Westeros to believe Aegon regarding his vision and his dream, in regards to the coming long night. When the northern host reached the Trident, it was very clear there was no situation where they win this battle, but still negotiating a peace should have been no easy task, given the kind of demand Aegon was making, the Kingdom of the North and Torrhen's submission, which we must recall is not something Torrhen's own lords were keen on. Yet not only was peace agreed, but seemingly in a single night. The idea goes Aegon must have had some sort of trump card that was a game changer for Torrhen, which made negotiations much more straightforward. If anything would convince a Stark and Torrhen to bend the knee so quickly without fuss, it would be Aegon's knowledge of the coming long night and White Walkers, something we know is deeply rooted into the history of the North and House Stark. It is possible that seeing the power of the dragons and how Aegon had managed to rally half of Westeros behind him so quickly, it might have shown Torrhen that perhaps standing behind this conqueror in a hypothetical coming long night might actually be their best chance of surviving. This theory also plays into the idea of the Pact of Ice and Fire between House Stark and the Black faction of House Targaryen during the Dance of the Dragons. If, like in House of the Dragon, Jace has knowledge of Aegon's prophecy via Rhaenyra and Cregan Stark via it being passed down by Torrhen, then it might be a factor as to what allowed the Pact to happen and why perhaps House Stark chose to side with Rhaenyra over Aegon II. It's hard to say how much Season 2 impacts this idea, given the context of the Pact is very different in the show than in Fire and Blood. The issue with the theory is there's no real hard proof for it, and it is based off an idea from the show that while fans are confident could apply to the books, we have no real confirmation as of yet in text. It's all very circumstantial. But what I will say is this: when you read Fire and Blood knowing about the concept of Aegon's prophecy, you can find loads of things like this where its knowledge in a situation really fits and makes sense. If it turns out that Aegon told Torrhen about his dream, and that's why he bent the knee, it would not be a surprise to me. But at the same time, it wouldn't surprise me if it simply was the overwhelming odds against Torrhen, and all but certain defeat that led to him bending the knee to Aegon.